Okay, welcome to lecture 48 for our Mor Nevuchim, or Guide to the Perplexed. And we are up to chapter 69 in part 1. So if you have the Pines English version, which I'm going to do most of the reading from, that would be on page 166 in the first volume. If you don't have, I'll try to make it sure to read in such a way that everyone can understand what we're saying. So in this chapter, Rambam goes into a little bit of a philosophical discourse about, and yes, believe it or not, about the nature of how God runs this world. I know that sounds quite a lofty, elevated subject, but it'll be interesting. I want to use this as an opportunity to point out a few things, because while he goes through philosophical concepts, and we'll learn them, we'll understand them, and they may not sound that interesting or that relevant. But however, I want to make a point, and I've made this almost every time we learn together, that Rambam is putting together building blocks so that as you go through, move your way through the Sefer, if you take each one of these building blocks and kind of put it in your memory bank, and you use it to build up the way you approach study, when you study Tanach, when you study the words of the Torah and the prophets, each building block helps you understand the way Rambam reads the Torah and helps you understand the things that otherwise would be extremely difficult to grasp, things that don't seem to make sense. And this building block of what we're going to study today, I'm going to show you after we study it today. I'm going to jump ahead a little, even though I stopped doing that for the most part, but I want to show you how this turns into a building block which helps you understand like verses in the Torah that, from a rationalist perspective, remember Rambam always is coming from his rationalist perspective, all of a sudden it makes sense. And that this building block, it says, oh, now you understand what a certain thing means. So I know I made you a little curious, but that's good. That's the point. So let's start in chapter 69. He starts off by saying, the philosophers, as you know, and some of us may not know, but you'll know now, they designate God, they call him, may be exalted, as the first cause or the first ground. The first ground is actually it's an English translation of an Arabic term, which also is just another term for cause. So they call God the first cause, and Rambam is referring directly to Aristotle, like he always done when he says the philosophers, that God is called the first cause. Okay, that's important. On the other hand, those who are generally known as mutakalamun, which is the Muslim philosophers, the Islamic scholars, which Rambam often quotes from, they avoid these designations very deliberately and designate him as the maker. Instead of calling God the first cause, they call him the maker or the creator. And they think there's a great difference between saying the cause and ground and saying maker. Why do they think that there's a difference between the two? For they say that if we say that he is a cause, that God is the first cause, then the existence of that which is caused follows necessarily. Then if God is the first cause, then there has to be something that he's causing. If all you're calling him is a cause, then there also has to be a result, something that he caused. However, this leads to the doctrine of the eternity of the world. And if you call him the first cause, then there has to be a cause, in which case the world has always been there. If God causes the world, and God can only be the first cause if he causes something, then the world has to be eternal, which would contradict the Islamic philosophers who think, as we do, that the world has a point at which it never existed, and then it was created. If, however, we say that he is the maker, we call him a maker, or we can also call him the creator, right, which would be synonymous here with maker. It does not necessarily follow that which is made exists together with him. For the maker sometimes precedes the act of making. You could have a person who is a maker who decides not to make something. Now, but they only consider a maker as preceding the act of making. Okay. Now, this is the assertion of people who do not make a distinction between what is in potentia and what is in actu. They don't understand. If you don't differentiate between saying a person can be a cause or an object, a person, or a being, in this case, God can be a cause in potentia, right? And in other words, he has the potential to make something happen, but he hasn't made it happen yet. And the same thing can happen with a maker. So the Rambam is going to say, I don't like this distinction. And he's going to explain to us why in this next paragraph. Because you know that regarding this subject, there is no difference between you're saying a cause and you're saying a maker. That, as far as I'm concerned, Rambam says, I don't care about these things. And what Rambam is really saying is, I don't need to go with all the other religious philosophers and argue on Aristotle and debate this nuance of maker versus cause. To me, that means it doesn't matter. I can use either term. In other words, I can go with Aristotle, is what Rambam is really about to say. For if you regard the cause as being likewise in potentia, it precedes its effect in time. It's possible that someone or something can be a cause in potentia. It is a cause of something that is going to happen. It just didn't happen yet, right? If on the other hand, it is a cause in actu, but you can differentiate that with something, a cause of something that's actually happening. So then its effect exists necessarily in virtue of the existence of the cause as a cause in actu. In other words, the thing which it caused exists because the thing that caused it to happen. Similarly, if you regard a maker as a maker in actu, you could say the same thing for a maker. A person can be a maker who makes something, the existence of which that which is made by him follows necessarily. For before he builds a house, a builder is not a builder in actu, he's a builder in potentia, right? He's a builder, but he hasn't yet built the house, right? Just as the matter of a particular house, before it is built, it is a state of is a potential for a house there, but it's not actually there yet. However, when a builder builds, then he becomes a builder in actu. So thus we have gained nothing by preferring the term maker to the term cause. It doesn't make a difference which one we choose. Fine. The whole purpose here is to show the equivalence of those terms. The reason why the Rambam says I went into this speech here is to tell you that I couldn't care less whether you use the term maker or the term cause, you have the same result. So I'm not getting involved into this debate between the Islamic philosophers and the Aristotelians. Okay? For just so Rambam is saying for a Jew, it makes no difference. We can go with either way. For just as we designate him a maker, even if that which is made by him be non-existent, he could still be a maker, just like a builder can be a builder, even if he hasn't built anything yet, right? So even if God could be a maker, even if the things that he is going to make he hasn't made yet, right? So because there's no impediment hindering him from accomplishing the act of making whenever he wills to. Why is he a maker? Because at any time, if he ever wants, he can make, right? So we are also permitted to designate him as in the same sense as a cause, right? Though that which is caused be non-existent, even if that which is caused is non-existent. Okay. So, but leaving that, so putting that on the ground for a second, let's take this a little further because it's going to get a little bit more interesting as we move through this thought process. In fact, the philosophers the reason why they chose the term cause instead of maker was for a reason. In other words, there's a reason why I like the term cause better than maker. Not because of their the reason why they choose cause is not because of their opinion that they think, because we know the Aristotelians felt that the world always existed and always will exist, right? They still felt that God was the first cause that makes everything happen the way it goes, but the world is eternal, which is contradictory to the Torah. Rambam is going to go into those details later, but understand that that is the key difference between the Aristotelians and the religious philosophers, both the Islamic ones that he quoted and the Jewish ones of whom Rambam himself is representing, right? The reason why they chose it is for other notions, of which I will give you a summary account. I'm going to explain to you now why they like the term cause, right? And which Rambam is going to say, in other words, Rambam also likes the term cause better than the term maker. Why is that? Because in natural science, it has been made clear that there are causes for everything that has a cause. And therefore, in other words, everything that exists, there are causes for them, right? And what are the things that exist? Okay, there's matter, right? In other words, there's the matter, the stuff of which the world is made, or the stuff of which a thing is made. There's form, in other words, the form which that thing takes, right? The efficient cause, which I'm going to take away the term efficient cause, and I'm going to use the Hebrew term, which is better one. Just give me 1 second. The efficient cause means the doer, the actor, okay? Right? It's the thing that it's doing, right? And the end. And he translates it in English, the end, but the Hebrew translates it as tachlis, which is better, or tachlit, which is better translated as the purpose, the goal of something. Now, and some of them are proximate causes and others remote ones. So everything has cause. Matter, something made matter into what it is, right? Now you and I can look at a table, for example, and we can say that it's made out of wood, right? So that it was made, how is it made out of wood? It came from a tree, right? How is the tree? The tree grew. How did the tree grow? And so on, and go on and so forth. How this matter came to be until you get to the level of the atom and molecules. That's how we would describe it in modern scientific terms. So there's a cause, and then, but then there's, why did it take the form that it took? Well, there was a builder that made it into a table, and you describe how he made it into a table, right? Then there's the efficient cause. There's, what is the table doing, right? What is what is it that the table does? Well, it holds things on it. It's so on and so forth. And then there's the purpose of the table. Well, why is there a table there, right? And so on. And we're going to go through examples so all this makes sense. Every cause belonging to one of these four is designated as cause and ground. Now, one of the opinions of the philosophers, an opinion with which I do not disagree, Rambam says, I'll agree with the philosophers on this one, is that God, may he be held precious and magnified, is three of these four. The only one that Rambam is subtracting from the four is the matter, the stuff, because that's physical things that you and I perceive, which Rambam has reiterated 1,000 million times, that God doesn't have any physical shape or form. So there's no physical matter that makes up God. However, he is the efficient cause, meaning he is the poel, he's the doer, right? He is the form, and he is the end. And this might sound a little confusing, but we're going to get to examples. And when we say the examples, it'll start to make sense. I don't know. I saw a hand go up, Leslie. Do you want to ask something?
No, I actually started a new app, so I was just.
Oh, that's fine.
Sorry,
Okay,
didn't mean to do that.
That's okay. That's no problem. Yeah, I was thinking that when I said let him give examples and it'll start to make sense, I thought that why your hand went down. But okay. So I'm turning the page to 168 now. So my purpose in this chapter, and I'm telling you, I'm asking you to hold the halt cup, what they say in Yiddish. Hold your head, follow through with this, even if it sounds kind of dry and philosophical, because the beauty of it will come blaring through once you understand what he's trying to say. And then I apply it to an actual verse, and then you're going to say, wow, like I can read this verse this way. And before I didn't understand how a rationalistic person can read such verses. But let's hold through this next couple of examples, and it'll be very much worthwhile. So my purpose in this chapter is to make it clear to you in what respect it is said of him may be exalted. What does it mean when I say that God is the cause, meaning he's the efficient cause, which I'm translating here the Hebrew term poel, he's the actor, that he is the form of the world, he's what gives it form, and that he is its end. And instead of end, I'm using the term purpose, tachlit. You should not busy your mind at this place with the subject of the temporal creation of the world by him. I know you're wondering, Rambam said, why I left out that fourth one about matter. Let's leave that out for a different subject, as is, right? Or if it's necessarily proceeding from him, as is the opinion of philosophers, because the subsequent we have a long discussion and a problem appropriate, so we'll get to that. What does that mean that God created matter? That fourth thing, we'll get to that later. Let's hold that off. The subject here is I want to explain what it means when I say that God's being the efficient cause of the partial actions occurring in the world, just as he is the efficient cause of the world as a whole. In other words, that God caused the entire world to be, but he also is the cause behind every single particular thing that happens within this world. How does this work? I shall accordingly say, it has been made clear in natural science that for every one of the four kinds of causes, one also needs to seek a cause. Every time something causes something, you look at the first thing and you say, well, what caused that? And then you look at that, you say, well, what caused that? And so on. Accordingly, with reference to every generated thing, there are to be found four causes proximate to it. And there are to be found causes for these causes and causes for the causes of the latter until one arrives at the first, until you get all the way back to the first one. For instance, this affected thing has a certain n as its efficient cause. What made n, right? And then this efficient cause in its turn has an efficient cause, and so on, all the way until you get to the first mover, who is in true reality the efficient cause of all these intermediaries. In truth, the original causer of the whole thing is really the causer in each and every thing, right? For if the letter Aleph is moved by the letter Bet, and the letter Bet is moved by the letter Gimel, right? Because Rambam spoke with the proper Gimel, right? Which is moved by the letter Daled, which is moved by the letter Hey. This process cannot go on endlessly. At some point, there has to be a mover in the beginning that makes the whole process go, right? It can't. It's like, I remember, there's this joke about, people that used to believe that the world is held up in space by on sitting on the back of a turtle, right? So they ask, well, if it's sitting, and that's what holds up, why doesn't the world just fall if it's sitting in space, right? I mean, obviously the question doesn't make sense, but just bear with me. So someone asks, well, if it's sitting on the back of a turtle, then what's the turtle sitting on? Another turtle. And then what's that? So on. So, and then what's that turtle? And so on, until the person shakes their head and says, well, it's just turtles all the way. Well, so the point here being, well, there has to be something that causes the whole thing. There's there's no doubt that Hey is the moving Aleph of Bays and Gimel and Dalet, right? It is truly said with the reference to the motion of Aleph that it is due to an action of Hey. So even though Aleph was moved by Bays, which was moved by Gimel, which was moved by Dalet, which was moved by Hey, it's also true if I said that Hey is moving Aleph, right? So in this way, every action that occurs in being is referred to God, as we shall make clear. That's why everything that happens in the world, right? God is the one that made the whole process go, even if it is worked by one of the proximate efficient causes. So even if I tell you that Reuven hit Shimon in the face, right? I can still say that God caused it, even though it was Reuven's personal choice that made that action happen, right? God being the ultimate cause of all actions that happen in the world, God is considered the efficient cause, is then the remotest one, maybe the farthest removed when you start adding up the list, but he's still obviously the cause for each and everything. Similarly, we find when attentively investigating the natural forms, this would be the example of the table, right? So the table, it has the form of a table, right? A table will eventually get ruined. It'll eventually fall apart, and if you leave it long enough, it'll probably rot or whatever, right? That they are inevitably preceded by another form, right? In this case, it was wooden boards, and before that, it was a tree, and before that, it was so on and so forth. So that gives the particular matter the disposition required for the reception of that particular form. The second form is in turn preceded by another form, until we finally come to the ultimate form that is necessary for the existence of the intermediate forms, while the latter are the cause of the proximate form, and so on and so forth, until you get back to where? Well, you get back to God. The ultimate form for all that exists is God. And you should not think our saying means that God has a form, right? Because God is not subject to generation and corruption. However, he is still the one who's responsible for the original form that the universe took at the moment of the Big Bang, right? God is the one that made that form take the shape that it did, and from that resulted everything that we see today. For our saying of him that he is the ultimate form does not denote that there is an analogy between him and the form endowed with matter. Remember, because God has no matter. Okay. One should rather consider, skipping a couple sentences, one should rather consider that just as every existent thing endowed with a form is what it is in virtue of its form, in fact, its being passes away and is abolished when its form passes away. There subsists the very same relation between the deity and the totality of the remote principles of existence. For the universe exists in virtue of the existence of the creator, and the latter continually endows it with permanence in virtue of the thing that is spoken of as overflow. Somehow we discuss the overflow of God towards this world. It's referring to whatever mechanism it is by which God makes the world have the form that it has. It's a mechanism which obviously a human being can't comprehend. That is how the world takes on the form that it has. Accordingly, if the non-existence of the creator were supposed, all that exists would likewise be non-existent. If that original thing that gives it form, which is God, didn't exist somehow, then everything that he's the created would not exist at all. God has therefore, with reference to the world, the status of a form with regard to a thing possessing a form, right? That's why we call God the original form, even though he doesn't have any form, in virtue of which it is that which it is, a thing, the true reality and essence of which are established by that form. Okay, such is the relation of the deity to the world. In this respect, it is said of him that he is the ultimate form and the form of forms, the Tzur Olamim, right? The rock of ages, which in this case, Tzur also could mean the rock of all of the worlds. He is the form of all of the worlds. That is, he is that upon which the existence and stability of every form in the world ultimately reposes. Because of this notion, we also call him Chei Olamim, living of the worlds, right? Right? Okay, meaning that he is the life of the world that shall be made clear. But now let's what about the third one? What about the tachlit, the purpose, the end? So matters are similar with regard to every end. And remember, the Pines uses end. I'm using the word purpose, which is, I think, a better translation. For when a thing has an end, you should seek the end of that end, right? So what do I mean? You say, as it were, for instance, that a throne has wood as its matter, right? A throne is made out of wood. Okay. A carpenter is its efficient cause. How did the throne come about? A carpenter made the throne. Squareness of a particular shape is its form. And what is its end? What's its purpose? To be sat upon. Then you're going to ask, okay, so the purpose is to be sat upon. Well, what's the purpose of sitting upon a throne? Okay. Thereupon it will be said that it consists in the lifting up. Well, you sit on it so that you should be higher. So you shouldn't be on the ground. You should be higher up, right? And the being elevated above the earth of the sitter upon the chair. That's the purpose of sitting. Well, thereupon, well, why do you want to be sit high? Why don't you sit low, right? What's the purpose of sitting high? So then you're going to answer that it consists in the magnification of the sitter in the eyes of those who see him. When a king is sitting high on a throne, then the people that look at him think that he's a great guy because he's sitting up on the big throne. So then you're going to ask, well, who cares if he's great? Why do we care if people think he's great, right? You'll ask, what is the end of his being great? And right thereupon you'll say, well, then he's feared and he's regarded with awe. People go, ooh, he's the big king, right? And they're afraid of him. They honor him. Well, what is the end of his being? What's the purpose in that? I mean, it sounds like a 2-year-old. Why? But the Rambam is purposely doing that, right? Until he gets to where the parent gets frustrated and doesn't know how to answer the 2-year-old anymore. But Rambam is going to get to that point, and we'll see what he answers. So then, if he's feared, then his orders will be obeyed. People will listen to him. Well, then you're going to say, well, why do we care? Who cares? Why should we listen to him? Who cares if it was his orders? Then you'll say, because that prevents harm being done by some people to others. The king can create order in the kingdom, make sure that people follow the laws. Thereupon you will further demand to know the end of this. Well, why do I care about that? Right? And so on. Thereupon you will receive the answer that it consists in the permanence of their existence in an orderly fashion. And so on and so forth. This should be done with regard to every end occurring in time until one finally arrives at his mere will. Eventually, you have to find an answer. Right? As you go through this why, and eventually you come to the answer. And it sounds like an overly simplistic answer, but it's the bottom line truth. It's because God wants it that way, right? And ultimately, you come to the will of God as the tachlis and purpose of everything. So we go through so many things that there's a purpose, that we see a purpose. And ultimately, at the end of the end, when we ask why, we get to that simple answer, because that's how God wants it, right? May he be exalted, according to a certain opinion, as shall be made clear, so that the ultimate answer will be, God willed it so. Or according the opinion of others, one finally arrives at the decision of his wisdom, right? Because his wisdom decided it so. In other words, there's a reason. It's not just because he wanted, because God has a wisdom, so he knows that this is the best way for it to be. His wisdom declared that this is how it should be, right? Thus, according to these two opinions, the order of all ends is ultimately due to his will and his wisdom. So now we said, when it comes to the causer, in other words, the person, the poel, the efficient cause, the one who's making things happen, we eventually keep asking and asking, we end up with God. The same thing when we come to a form. Something has a form because it had a form prior to that, and eventually it's God, the Chayol Amim, the one who's giving life to the worlds. That's the ultimate form. And then when we go on the other end and we talk about the purpose of something, we keep asking and asking and asking. And eventually we get to the answer that it's because of the will of God. So now that we said this, right, according to our opinion, they are identical with his essence. All of these things lead to one thing. Remember, in God, it's all one. So God's will, right, which is the answer to all the why questions, and God's creation or giving of the life of creation to the world, all of those things are within God as one. They're not three different things. I mean to say they're not something other than his essence. Consequently, he may be exalted is the ultimate end of everything, and the end of the universe is similarly a seeking to be like unto his perfection as far as it is in his capacity. So the end result of the world, the end purpose of the world, is that everything should be exactly the way God wants it to be. And that is how history is going. History is going in the direction of, let's bring this world to a place where it is how God wants it to be. So now you're starting to get a little glimpse into the meaning of all this. Until now, this was all a bunch of philosophical jargon, and we're trying to make sense of it and make meaning out of it. But hold on, because all of a sudden it's going to start meaning something, right? All of a sudden we start to realize that in virtue of this, it is said of him that he is the end of the ends. The final reason of everything is, Bayomahu, yeah, and the day in the future, this world will be perfected as such that it will be exactly as God wants it to be. And that is, and ultimately, that's also the cause. He caused this to cause this to cause this to cause this, so that we can reach the end, which is the ultimate end, right? For this reasons, the philosophers designate him as a cause and not only as a maker. That's why philosophers like to call God a cause rather than a maker, because when you use the term maker, you think of a builder, you're only thinking of one of those things, a form. When you talk about a cause, then you're talking about all of those things. Know, however, that in some people from among the Mutakalman engaged in speculation, ignorance, and presumption, reached such a degree that finally they said, if the non-existence of the creator were assumed, then the non-existence of the thing that the creator has brought into existence would not follow necessarily. By taking him away from being a cause, which some of these philosophers were doing, right, and saying that God is just a maker, well, then just like a maker could decide not to make something, right, and that he could still be a maker even if whatever it is that he's supposed to make isn't made, but the thing that he makes could go on and exist even when the maker isn't there. So if a builder builds a house and then the builder passes on, right, the house is still there, right? Because that which the affected passes away when the maker has passed after having been affected it. Now that which they have mentioned would be correct if he were only the maker. That's true if you're going to use that term. And if the thing that he affected had no need of him for its permanence to be lasting, as the case of a carpenter. However, because God is not just the creator, he's not just the poel, right, which was one of the three factors, but he is also the form of the world. He is also what gives the world its entire form. And he is also the purpose of the world. So God is all three of those, which is therefore better to use the term cause than it is to use the term maker. It would be impossible that he who continuously endows it, that the world could last if God were to cease existing. So that's the end of chapter 69. But I promised you that I was going to point out a very practical verse where the Rambam takes this principle and uses it. And all of a sudden, you can understand why this is such an important concept for a rationalist thinker when he or she looks at the Torah and looks at Tanach and tries to study it. So let me go through. There's one story. I'm in the. You don't necessarily have to look here, but it's in part 2 of Rambam, chapter 48. I'm sorry, Memches, where he discusses this topic, and he uses this to help us understand psukim. So Rambam here says whenever it says in the Torah a phrase, for example, Yishlach devaro in Tehillim, Yishlach devaro vayim, that God sends out his word and melts the snow, right? So it doesn't mean, right, that God is hovering around the world in the springtime and he sees a patch of snow and it's time to melt, and he goes and breathes on it and then poof, it melts, right? We know what it means, right? It means that God created nature in such a way, right, so that the nature is beautiful, it's wonderful, and we know that what happens is the snow melts in the springtime because God made nature, right? God was the ultimate cause in the beginning. But if you ask the scientist, or you don't have to be a scientist, what causes the snow to melt? Well, it got warmer outside. Why did it get warmer outside? Well, because of the tilt of the earth in the springtime. It's closer to the sun, so on and so forth, right? So the same thing goes when it says, for example, in my Navi podcast, I'm learning in Shmuel in Melachim Aleph right now, where it tells the story of Eliyahu Navi, right? And God says that go out from where you are and you'll meet, and there's a widowed woman, a poor widowed woman who's going to meet you, and she'll be your sustenance. That's how you'll live. So Eliyahu goes, and he ends up, he goes and he meets this woman, and so on. And it says over there, the pasuk says over there, that I commanded that this woman, this widowed woman, should be there in order to support you. Now, one could learn that and think that God did some miraculous event to make it that this woman would just happen to be there. But the Rambam, who's a rationalist, it's not what happened, right? The woman didn't have a vision. It doesn't say anywhere she had a vision in the middle of the night that said, go to this and this place and a prophet is going to come meet you. It didn't happen. She went out because she was going about her business, in that case, to collect wood so she can cook her last bits of food at home, right? So when it says that God made it happen, right? And this is true, and the Rambam says example after example after example. Every time the Torah says that God made it happen, that so-and-so should be there. I don't know whether it's Aaron meeting Moshe on his way back into Egypt, or pick your verse anywhere in Tanach where the hints, it says, that God made it happen, that such and such a person would be there. It doesn't mean that there was some sort of a miraculous intervention. What it means is that God is the ultimate cause of nature, and God is what set up the circumstances so that this meeting could occur. Now, so that in other words, what Rambam just did was he took the supernatural out of it, right? There was no miracle event, right? It's the world going along in its normal path, that Eliyahu wandering through a land of people that are starving, right? The likelihood of him bumping into and coming across a poor widowed woman who's trying to collect twigs that has hardly anything to eat, right? That's what's going to happen. The Rambam would then be arguing that the event of Eliyahu meeting this woman didn't particularly have to be this particular woman. It was nothing. It was just that the circumstances were such that Eliyahu was going to meet a poor woman who was starving, who had to collect a few twigs to cook her last few bits of food, right? And this comes true when you look at almost any event in Tanakh. I'm bringing examples just because from places where I was just reading. So, for example, where it says, if those of you remember, after Solomon died, so his son Rechavam took over, and Rechavam took really bad advice, and he decided to, from his young advisors, he decided to crack down on the people and load their tax and labor burden really hard, which caused a rebellion, which ended up in the splitting of the kingdom, right? And it goes through the story of how Rechavam did that, his arrogance. He decided to take bad advice and just be arrogant. Right. And then it says afterwards, and God had predicted beforehand to the prophet that eventually the kingdom was going to be split. So even though the verses laid out a very clear progression of how Rechavam went about making this very arrogant, bad decision, the verse says at the end that even though Rechavam did it, right, this was the fulfillment of God's word, because God said that it was going to happen, that the kingdom was going to split. So when you look at that, you start to think, it almost sounds like the verses are saying that Rechavam didn't even have any private control over his decisions, his really bad decisions, and that all of this was just God playing games with his puppets and making Rechavam make stupid decisions. But the Rambam says, no, you're learning it all wrong. Nothing supernatural happened here. There was no God playing puppets. It was people doing what people do. Rechavam was an arrogant man. Right? He was an arrogant man, and he was a selfish man, and he was a tyrant. So he made selfish, arrogant, tyrannical decisions, which resulted, because that's how God made the world. When you act that way, you cause rebellions, and you make kingdoms split, and you end up with civil wars and fighting. So what Rambam is doing with this, what seemed to be a very philosophical, highfalutin, dry piece of knowledge, he tells you now all of a sudden, when you pick up a pasuk in Tanakh, how are you supposed to learn it? When it says that God causes something, what does it mean that he causes something? And Rambam uses exactly the principle he taught us here later in chapter 48, which we'll get to, and we're going to learn it again together. He uses that principle in order to help us look at a verse which a non-rationalist would look at it and say, oh, yeah, God plays around with his puppets. He makes this happen here, this happen there. It's all good. It makes sense. But for a rationalist, that doesn't make sense. What do you mean? People aren't puppets. People have free will. What does that mean? And Rambam tells us exactly what it means. It means that God is the cause because he's created a world that works in that way, a world in where arrogance leads to discord, a world where selfishness leads to loss of your fortune, a world where not listening to the wrong advice will get you into trouble, and therefore, because there's a world created that way, it fulfilled God's word, right? And God makes a world where when people are starving, there's going to be widows because people are dying of starvation, and there's going to be people that are searching for twigs of wood, and there's going to be a woman out there who you're going to bump into when you're wandering around the fields. So this is I really want to say this because I want you to understand this. Every time we learn one of these very complicated and deep philosophical ideas that Rambam is trying to tell us, they're not just dry philosophical stuff, which makes most yeshiva guys very bored, which is why most people stop learning Moreh Nevuchim after the first 10 chapters. But if you pay attention, you'll see how gorgeous this is, and how this really can enable you to open up a Tanach as a rationalist. And all of a sudden, the verses make so much sense, and they have such beautiful lessons to teach us. Anyway, this is all I prepared for tonight. I want to open the floor for questions, any comments, etc. I'm going to open the floor, and you just go ahead and unmute yourself.
So Rambam, the saying, there are no coincidences. So Rambam would say, yes, things are just coincidence.
Well, coincidence, it depends what you mean when you say there's no coincidences. So the Rambam would say that everything has a very clear reason and cause, right? And everything, we can learn lessons from all of these things, but he will discuss, sometimes certain things happen because of exactly how much hashgacha, like how much God controls each and every detailed event, is a subject that I'll put aside, because the Rambam is going to discuss that in detail.
Okay,
right?
So I'm jumping
He's
ahead.
going to discuss that in detail. But when a human being makes a choice, right, or an animal, because Rambam it leaves open the fact that an animal could make a choice, right, on a certain level, right, to do something, and then there's a result. There is you can look at the cause of the cause of the cause, right? So, for example, let's say you're looking at, God forbid, a lion, kills somebody, let's say, right? So you can say, oh, God made it happen, or you can say, wait a minute, why did the lion do? Well, the lion's hungry. You went ahead, you killed all of its habitat, it has no place to go, and you put a bunch of people there. So you can say, well, that's a cause, right? You took away its natural source of food. So or you can do all kinds of things to decide, like, what is the cause of the cause of the cause, until you come up with understanding there's meaning behind what happened, right? Not necessarily not a magical meaning. This is the key thing. It's an actual scientifically verifiable cause. It's not because I didn't do a mitzvah yesterday, right? It's because right, there's some kind of a supernatural thing. The Rambam didn't say anything about that. The cause is the obvious thing. You look at it. Aleph moved Bays, Bays moved Gimel, Gimel moved Dalet, Dalet moved Hey, right? I gave you a push, so then you fell on the other guy. And we think about the classic, chain car reaction on the highway. I hit you, so you flew forward and hit him, and he flew forward and hit him, right? There's a clear cause and effect that's scientifically notifiable, seeable, or identifiable is the word I was looking for. Sorry. Yeah. So in that sense, yeah, there is no what's the word? Coincidences, right? Anyway.
Okay.
Any other comments on what we learned today so far? Or questions? Observations? If there isn't, that's fine. We're going to continue next week with chapter 70, where he's going to go back to some of his translations again. And then for the most of the rest of this of part one is going to go into heavy philosophical principles, and I'm going to try my best to do like I did today and show you after we do the dry philosophy stuff and start, and your head starts spinning with all of these philosophical terms. But then I'm going to try to show you how important these, that he's not just saying them just because he likes philosophizing. He's saying them because they have very practical use when we're trying to rationally understand the Torah, which is the purpose of this book. The purpose of this book is the people that are perplexed. You read the Torah, and it seems to be saying often things which just don't make sense to our rationalistic minds. And how do we make the two work? And he's giving us these principles so that we can make those two work. And I hope that everyone can gain some benefit from this. So thank you very much. If there's no other comments, I'm going to close off for the evening.
Thank you. It was good. Great class.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening. I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
I won't be here next week, but
All right.
or
It's
the
okay.
week after that. Well, maybe the week after, but it's been for the first time. It was pretty interesting.
All right. Thanks. I'm going to be sending links to all the recordings. If you ever have time, they'll be there. All right.
I'm a little more perplexed than everybody else, I think.
We're all perplexed. Good to be perplexed. All right. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.